To our Bible study here on Sunday morning. We're glad you're with us. And those that are joining us by way of social media, you're certainly welcome. Encourage you to be with us at each opportunity you might have. I heard David Edwards say this morning, the older I get, the colder I get. So I guess that's true for all of us. I'm not sure, but that's probably a good way to summarize it. It has been a rough week, and hopefully... Philip said it's going to get worse. I'm being optimistic that it's going to get better. But anyway, we're glad that you're here and look forward to worshiping this morning. With us this morning is Daniel Rogers. He's filling in for Jason. I have no sympathy for Jason and Jill and Murray and Shara. They're all in Hawaii right now. So when they come back, have no sympathy at all for them. Just whatever. Maybe they'll all bring us a pineapple or something. I don't know. We'll see. But they're out, and we're glad to have Daniel with us. Those that I have that are sick, Johnny Hunt's home this morning, and Gerald Rainey is still in Mercy Health, but they're planning on discharging him tomorrow from his 2 weeks of rehab. So, and then hopefully he'll be able to resume his chemo and radiation treatments. Are there any others of a number that we need to list at this time? If not, let's have a word of prayer before our study. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day, for our many blessings we often take so granted. We thank you especially, Father, for thy Son. We're grateful that we can come and study a portion of thy word, and we ask as we do so that we apply it to our lives to help us to be better Christians and help us to reach out to a world that is lost. Forgive us of our sins and many shortcomings, for this is our prayer in Christ's name, and amen.
Good morning. It's good to be with you again. I want to second the idea that we don't have any sympathy on Jason whatsoever, because he has been texting me and taunting me about these temperatures this week while I'm up here trapped in the frozen tundra and he's down there in the tropical paradise. So, give him a hard time when he gets back. I remember a couple of years ago, his brother Jared went to Hawaii and asked me to fill in for him teaching his class at North Jackson, which I was happy to do. And when he came back, by way of thanks, he brought me a couple of fresh pineapples, and those were the best pineapples I've ever had in my life. But let me say this, if Jason brings you a fresh pineapple, don't get carried away and eat too much of it, because it will not be easy on your stomach. Oh, they're delicious. If I could get you to switch to the slideshow that says "In My Father's House," that'll be the one we'll be looking at this morning. I'd like to introduce to you a few ideas together this morning that I hope will give you a framework that'll be helpful to you in looking particularly at your Old Testament studies, but also in framing the picture of the story of the scheme of redemption for when you come to it in the New Testament. And by way of doing that, I want to recommend a book for your library if you're interested. And it's a book called The Epic of Eden by Sandra Richter. The Epic of Eden by Sandra Richter. I have it with me this morning if you want to look at it. You can get it on Amazon and almost anywhere you get books. Now, let me caution you of this. Sandra Richter, as best I can tell, is a Methodist seminary professor and speaker, which means that not all of her conclusions are accurate. And specifically in this book, I would warn you about her conclusions about the final reward for God's people. She has the idea that the earth will be somehow reformed and we'll live here on earth in an earthly paradise, which I think is contrary entirely to what the Bible teaches. But the value in this book, and the reason I recommend it, is because Dr. Richter has a very good understanding of the archaeology and the history and the culture of the ancient Old Testament world and how it fits into some of the key features of our Old Testament Bible in a way that makes those ideas really come to life and useful for us. And so that's where I want us to begin this morning. One of the key features of the Old Testament, and really the New as well, is the concept of covenant. But to understand what a covenant is, you really have to first understand the concept of what the Hebrews called the Beit Ab. Beit Ab, B-E''T-A-B. It's a compound word, and it's made up of two words that you're actually familiar with, if you may or may not know that you are. The first word is the word that typically comes across in our Bibles as Beth, B-E-T-H. And you'll find it in names of places like Bethlehem, which means house of bread. Bethel, which means house of God. Bethphage, Bethany, Bethsaida. All throughout the Bible, we run across these places that have Beth in the name, and the word, the word simply means house of, or house. Ab is a shortened form of the word Abba, which you may recall from not only the prayer of Jesus in the garden, but some of our songs as well, is a word that simply means father. And so the term Beit Ab means father's house. The father's house was the way the Jews in their idiom, or even before they were called Jews, the ancient Israelites in their idiom would refer to home. That was the family compound, and it was called the father's house. And in the father's house, in that place and time, there was a particular way of doing things that was very common across the ancient Near East. First and foremost, you had the patriarch, the oldest living male, who was responsible for the well-being of the entire family clan. It was on his shoulders to provide for them all the necessities of life: food, clothing, shelter, protection from enemies and elements and wild animals, things of that nature. Not only that, it was his responsibility to be the law of the family clan. In other words, he was lawgiver. He was the arbiter of how the law applied in particular situations where family members might have a dispute. He was the executioner of the law when punishment had to be meted out. He was also required to be the rescuer of any family member who might fall into danger and have to be rescued in some way or another. And so he provided protection and provision for the members of the family. The members of the family then would include the patriarch and his wife, and any minor children that they might have. And then when the children grew to adulthood, the daughters would marry, and they would become a part of the Beit Ab of whoever their husband was. The sons, however, would remain at home. The eldest son, it was generally considered, would be the heir apparent to be the next patriarch of the family. And so you will read about, for example, in your Old Testament, that the firstborn son typically would receive a double portion of the inheritance. Now, he didn't do that because he was somehow considered to be better than his brothers. The reason he received a double portion of the inheritance was very practical. He received a double portion of the inheritance because his inheritance was the sustenance out of which he would now have to take care of the entire family clan. And so it was more of a stewardship than a gift that he was receiving. And so he would be the one then who would step into his father's shoes and would be the next patriarch of the family. And from about the age of 13, he would become his father's apprentice, and he would follow his father around in the business of running the family compound and seeing to the crops and the livestock and doing the business dealings and things of that nature, and he would learn the trade. The younger sons would also have responsibilities, and the women would have responsibilities. And within the family clan, every member who was old enough to do anything useful had certain responsibilities and obligations that they were accountable for. And that worked very, very well as a general rule. Everyone sort of knew where they fit into the family. They knew what their job was. They knew what they could expect of one another. However, from time to time, family clans would have to deal with members of other family clans. And that raised this question. They're not from my family, so how do I know I can trust them? How do I know that if I agree to do something for them and they agree to do something for me in exchange, that I can somehow hold them accountable? And that's where the concept of the covenant came from. If you dig back deep enough in the writings, the archaeology, the history of the ancient Near East, one of the things that you will find very, very quickly is that when those people spoke of a covenant, they often spoke of it in terms of adopting someone as a family member. Now, covenants really came in about two categories. You had one category of covenants where you would have two people who were more or less on equal playing field with one another in terms of power. And they would treat one another as though they were siblings if they formed a covenant with one another. You are my brother, I am your brother. And so they would talk about one another in those terms. And they would have responsibilities to one another under the covenant as brother to brother. The second category of covenant would be the category where you would have someone who was very powerful making a covenant with someone who was relatively less powerful. And in those cases, most of the time, the terminology would be something like father and son. I am your father and you are my son, and I am taking you under my protection. Most of the time when you would see those, it would be something like this. You would have a king who had, by conquest, acquired some land, and he goes to the people who live on that land and he makes a covenant with them. And he says, look, I will provide protection for you from any enemies that may come. And I will allow you to live on this land and farm this land. And all I ask in exchange is, number one, that you give me a tax of the proceeds of the land, whether it might be the wool of your sheep or the milk of your cattle or the meat or the grain or whatever it might be that your land produces. And number two, that if I have to go into battle, you will send whatever people are capable of your household as soldiers to fight in my behalf. And in return, I will provide for you, I will protect you, you will be considered like my son. And so you have those kinds of covenants. Now, when we come to God's dealings with man in the Bible, we see very quickly that God begins to adopt those covenant traditions that were familiar to the people. And you will see terminology that's used, particularly in the Old Testament, that was taken directly out of the covenant language that we now know by virtue of archaeology was common throughout that part of the world. For example, a couple of times in the Old Testament, God refers to a covenant of salt. Do y'all remember that language? A covenant of salt. Do you know what that is? You may have actually seen in some wedding ceremonies a salt ceremony. I don't know if y'all have seen that. I saw it in one a while back. And what would happen is the bride and the groom would each have a little vial of salt. And as a part of the ceremony, they would each pour their vial of salt into a common vial and mix it up. And somebody would say, now, if you can pick out his salt from hers, then you can separate. But until you can figure out how to do that, you are bound together. And that was the idea. That actually comes from an Old Testament concept. And that's exactly what would be done when a covenant would be stricken, is that people frequently carried salt with them in their daily supplies bags, and they would mix their salt together. And the idea was, as soon as we can figure out how to separate your salt from mine, then we can break this covenant. But until, we won't do that. Now, I say all of that to say this. You can really picture the Old Testament in the context of 5 covenants. I don't know if I forgot to turn this thing on. There it goes. Okay. There we go. There are 5 covenants in the Old Testament that really form a framework for the entire Old Testament. There is a covenant that God makes with Adam in Genesis chapter 1. There is the covenant that God makes with Noah in Genesis chapter 9. There is the covenant between God and Abraham that begins in Genesis chapter 12, and it is further elucidated in chapters 15 and 17. And then there is the covenant that God makes through Moses that really begins about Exodus chapter 20. And I've put forward after that because it takes up the rest of the book of Exodus by and large, all of the book of Leviticus, portions of the book of Numbers, and is reiterated in the book of Deuteronomy. So start at Exodus 20 and just keep reading. And then you have the covenant that God makes with David, specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Those covenants have particular features that are of extreme importance in understanding the overall story of the Bible. And let me suggest to you that whenever you study the Old Testament in particular, that you refer back to this structure, because where you fall in this structure in terms of where you're at in the Old Testament will have a lot to say about where you are in the overall scheme of redemption and where you've come from and where you're going. Now, incidentally, when we come to the New Testament, we will find that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of all 5 of these covenants. But let's look at them in a little bit more detail. Let's look at the covenant with Adam. God specifically says to Adam in Genesis chapter 1, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Subdue the earth and rule over the creatures. I've given you every plant for food." Now, this is clearly a covenant of the type where you have a more powerful party and a less powerful party. Specifically, God is the creator and the giver of all things, and Adam is the creation. All right? So God says to Adam, "I have given you the earth." Very much like a king might say to someone dwelling in the land, "I have given you this land." All right? Now, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. All right? This is here for you to use to your benefit. Be fruitful, prosper, do well, fill the earth. Now, think about that just a moment. Inherent in the idea of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth is the underlying concept of life. I have given you life. And in Genesis chapter 2, we read specifically that God had formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And so God had literally given life to man. Now, you know the rest of the story, and you know that in Genesis chapter 3, mankind introduces death into the world because he violates God's commandment not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so, for the one to whom God had given life and to whom God had commanded, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," when he transgressed a part of the covenant, he introduced death into the world. Now we get down to the New Testament, and particularly in the book of Romans, you might recall that Paul makes the argument that the first Adam brought death. He reiterates this argument, by the way, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But the second Adam, referring to Jesus, brought life, right? So be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I'm giving you this stewardship to fill it. Subdue the earth and rule over the creatures. Now God is giving him a stewardship, a responsibility. Think about this, step back a moment and think about this in terms of a king who is giving a particular piece of land into the stewardship of a servant. The king doesn't have time, nor does he have the inclination nor the resources to come around and double check every decision that landholder makes. Oh, I'm going to run sheep in this pasture, and I'm going to plow up this pasture, and I'm going to plant barley there. Oh, no, I think you should run sheep over there and plant barley over here. You see, he doesn't have time for all of that. And so he entrusts to the good judgment of the landholder how and when and what to do with the land, provided he's a good steward. That's essentially what God is doing here. He's entrusting to Adam and his good judgment to subdue the earth and rule over it, to be a good steward. And then he says, "I've given to you every plant for food." God specifically mentions plants here in this particular text, and we don't actually read of God specifically authorizing meat as food until after Noah. Now, does that mean that no one ever ate meat before Noah? I don't know. I don't know that I can be that dogmatic. I just know that I can say that God specifies plants here, and then he mentions meat specifically in Genesis chapter 9. Interesting feature, but I wouldn't want to make more of it than it warrants. The next covenant is the one with Noah, and you recall the story after the flood. Noah comes off the ark. The only surviving humans in the world are Noah and his wife, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And God makes a new covenant with Noah. Sounds an awful lot in some respects like the covenant he had made with Adam. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. He's starting over now with a cleansed earth, a new earth, an earth, by the way, that is entirely transformed as a consequence of sin taking over the world. And I would argue in many ways the world into which Noah steps in Genesis chapter 9 is an entirely different planet than the one that his ancestors lived on for many, many reasons. God says, fear of you will be on every creature. That's interesting to me. Because while God did command Adam to subdue the earth and rule over the creatures of the earth, he never mentions fear in Genesis chapter 1. He does mention it in Genesis chapter 9. Richter makes the argument that as a consequence of sin, the relationship between man and God's creation has been altered at this point. Again, I don't know that I can go quite that far with it, but it's interesting that God uses different language. And I think it's worthwhile to observe that when God says something differently than he said it before, I think it's fair to assume that he means a different shade of meaning by using different words. He says, I've given to you every moving thing as food. Here's where he specifically authorizes meat. But he makes this point. The blood is the life. And the life is in the blood. And if anyone sheds man's blood, I will require it of him. Now that is a concept that becomes immensely important when we come down to the New Testament. And it's introduced to us in this very, very early covenant, this idea of blood. Blood and life, inextricably linked. Now, this morning, a little bit later on, we're going to partake of a feast around this table. And one of the elements of that feast is the fruit of the vine, which symbolizes the blood of Jesus. The blood of Jesus, of course, was his life. Giving his life, Mark 10:45, a ransom for many. And it was, according to Matthew chapter, I believe it's 26:28, the blood of the new covenant. Isn't that interesting? Blood and covenant linked together. All right, so life is in the blood. That's going to be important. And then I will never again destroy the earth by water. That was immensely important to Noah, and I suppose to all of us in a sense. But it also has ramifications for the New Testament. For example, in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter argues from this covenant that God is not going to destroy the earth again by water. However, he will destroy it again with fire. And for those who were arguing against Peter in that day that everything continues just as it has from the beginning, he says, remember the story of Noah? Oh, Jesus had said, didn't he? They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the flood came. Things looked like everything was going to go on just like it always would, just like it does now. But when the Lord comes, he'll come as a thief in the night. Well, the covenant of Noah. All right. Next we have the covenant with Abraham. And really I would argue that there's one covenant, but it is progressively revealed over the 3 chapters that we talked about a moment ago, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17. God says to him, I will make of you a great nation, and I will give you a name. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed, and I will give you the land that I will show you. Notice, first of all, this I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you language. This, again, is the language of a covenant specifically between a king and a vassal. And this is the language in which a king would say to a servant, you have my explicit protection against all enemies. Anyone who deals with you as if they were dealing directly with me, and how they treat you is how I will assume they would treat me, and I will repay them accordingly. That's effectively what God is saying to Abraham there. I will protect you and I will provide for you. Now, that's of great importance because the prelude to this covenant in Genesis 12 is God saying to Abraham, get thee from thy, remember the next two words? Father's house, Beit Ab. Abraham knew very well what a Beit Ab was. In fact, he was heir apparent to Terah's Beit Ab in Ur of the Chaldees. When he left his father's house, folks, it wasn't just like picking up stakes and moving would be for you and me in the 21st century. Now, picking up stakes and moving, if you've ever done it, is fairly traumatic now. But this is not, I've never lived in a house that my family has owned for generations. I've never lived on a piece of land that my family has cultivated for generations. I've never lived anywhere with the implicit understanding that this piece of ground belongs to my family in perpetuity, and it's our responsibility to see after it and to glean from it our living for as far forward as time allows us to go. But that was the concept of the Old Testament Beit Ab. Even after the nation of Israel was established, if you read carefully the laws of land ownership, when Joshua divvies up the land among the people, you could sell your land, but not permanently. You could only sell it till the next year of Jubilee, and then it came back to your family because it was a perpetual possession to the Beit Ab. So when God says to Abraham, or Abram at that time, get thee from thy father's house, he's saying leave behind everything that you ever had planned for your future, the future of your family. You're leaving it all behind. It would not only be like picking up and moving, but it would also be like leaving behind your retirement accounts, your entire career that you've built, everyone that you know, everything that you know, and going to a place that is farther removed than we can quite frankly imagine, because the world we live in today is so connected that, to move 200 or 300 miles from here wouldn't be to change all that much culturally speaking. To move 200 or 300 miles from Ur of the Chaldees would be to be among total strangers that might never have even heard of Ur. Interesting concept. All right. You're going to go. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. I will make of you a great nation. Of course, we know the importance of that. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, when we get down to the book of Galatians, Paul will argue that the ultimate fulfillment of that is that the seed of Abraham is Jesus. And by virtue of Jesus and his sacrifice, those of us who conform to the trusting spirit of Abraham in following God's commandments today are just as much heirs of Abraham as if we had physically descended from him. In fact, more so, because we're spiritual heirs, adopted into the family of God. And then I will give you the land. The land, of course, being vitally important to his livelihood. All right, got to move ahead. The covenant with Moses is of vital importance that we don't have time to fully unpack this morning. But notice this. Number one, the nation of Israel is to become a holy nation. This is the template for the church, ultimately. God is teaching people very much the way we teach children. Now, if you were to go into the kindergarten class or the preschool class this morning and sit down and observe the lesson that the teachers are teaching, very likely you would see something like little cutouts of Bible characters, maybe on a popsicle stick. Or you would see the children coloring pictures, or they would sing songs with hand motions and things like that. Why do we do those things? Because it's giving them these ideas in a form that they can grasp, right? That's exactly what God's doing throughout the Old Testament. He's giving picture lessons and stories and things that people can latch onto and understand, so that when we get to the New Testament and he begins to expound the spiritual truths that those stories and pictures and things embody, now we have a way to relate to them. And so that's what he's doing here. You're a holy nation, all right? I'm going to literally call out a nation, the nation of Israel, and you're going to be my nation. Okay? The presence of God is going to dwell among them, literally. If you read in the book of Numbers, God gave specific instructions that they were to encamp around the tabernacle, so that you had the tabernacle in the center, you had the three families of the priests on the north, south, and west side, you had the high priest and Moses on the east side, and then on the outside of that, on each side, you had three tribes encamped around the tabernacle. And so God quite literally, physically dwelt in the midst of them by means of the tabernacle. And then there was a ritual pattern for priesthood and sacrifice. I could not possibly overemphasize the importance of priesthood and sacrifice. Now, priesthood and sacrifice does not spring anew into the law of Moses as though there were no such thing prior to that. Abraham was sacrificing. Cain and Abel were sacrificing. We read about sacrifice from the second generation of mankind on. And to have a sacrifice implies some level of priesthood. And in fact, we read about priests before the law of Moses. For example, Abraham gives tithes to Melchizedek, who was a priest of God Most High and is later revealed to be a high priest. Moses' father-in-law was Jethro, the priest of Midian. Very likely Job was more or less a contemporary of Abraham and functions as a priest. And not only a priest for his family, as we read about it in the first chapter of Job, but if you go to the end of the book, we find him sacrificing not only for his family, but for his three friends as well, which may indicate that he had a high priesthood. But at any rate, the concepts of priesthood and sacrifice are now very much put into a written law. These are your responsibilities. These are how you offer the sacrifices. The first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus specify the procedures for the different sacrifices. And then we talk about how the priests dress and what the priests do and so on and so forth. Well, that's all laying the groundwork for the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, for example, in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter's going to refer to Christians as a royal priesthood. And in Hebrews chapter 13, the Hebrews writer refers to us as offering up the sacrifices of our lips, so on and so forth. So we are priests, and we dwell with sacrifices in this covenant. Of course, first and foremost is the sacrifice of Jesus. But Paul would beseech us, Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, to present our bodies a living sacrifice, wouldn't he? And so on and so forth. So those concepts are also in back of everything we read in the New Testament. The final covenant that I want to look at this morning is the covenant with David. And that is a very interesting one. You will recall at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 7 that David has been given unprecedented power within Israel. God has allowed him to consolidate the kingdom. He has allowed him to establish a capital in Jerusalem. David has moved now the tabernacle into Jerusalem along with the estranged Ark of the Covenant that had fallen into the hands of the Philistines. And David has this idea, and he calls the prophet to him, and he says, I want to build a house for God. It's not fitting that I live in a palace of cedar while God lives in a tent. And the prophet initially says to him, go and do what's in your heart. But then when he goes out of the house, God says, hold on just a minute, that's not what I said for you to tell him. That's Alabama paraphrase. That's not exactly how God put it. But he says to David, you're not going to build me a house, but I will build you a house. Now, the interesting thing there is that the Hebrew word for house is a lot like our English word for house in the sense that it can have a double meaning. It can mean the structure in which you live, which is what David had in mind when he was going to build a house for God, but it can also mean your household, your family. And that's what God is doing. He's making a pun on David's word house that he wants to make for God, and he's saying, I'm going to build you a house, not a physical structure, but a family, a dynasty. David's dynasty would rule on the throne in Jerusalem as long as there was a throne in Jerusalem. Until God allowed the Babylonians to come in and sack the city, destroy the temple, and tear down the walls, David's lineage ruled on that throne in Jerusalem. And when we come to the book of Acts, chapter 2, and Peter is introducing Jesus to those people as the Messiah of God, how does he go about doing it? He goes to David, and he quotes David, and he says, now who was David talking about when he said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until your enemies be made your footstool? He said he couldn't be talking about himself because David foresaw the resurrection of Christ, and he quotes another of David's writings, right? He says he couldn't be talking about himself because we know David's dead and buried. In fact, his grave is right here in the city with us. In fact, just a few years before that, Pilate had infamously looted the grave of David and stolen a bunch of gold and used it for his own terms and had scandalized the Jews. They knew very well where the tomb of David was. And so Peter is saying to them, look, we know where David is and we know that he's dead and buried. He's not talking about himself. Who's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. Who is Jesus? How does Matthew introduce him? The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why? Matthew is referencing two of those 5 covenants. The lineage, the seed. And so now we know that not only is the world going to be blessed through the seed of Abraham, but specifically that's going to come through the tribe of Judah as Jacob had prophesied at the end of the book of Genesis, and within the tribe of Judah from the family of David. And when you get down to the New Testament and you read the 2 genealogies that we have of Jesus, Matthew chapter 1, which traces the genealogy of Joseph, and Luke chapter 3, which traces the genealogy of Mary, what you find is both of them descended from David, from different sons. Joseph through Solomon, Mary through Nathan. They converge at Zerubbabel, who is a highly interesting character in the Old Testament, and then they separate again and come back together in the marriage of Joseph and Mary. And so Jesus is going to be the fulfillment of this promise to build a house for David. And then he says, I will establish a place for my name. Now, when Isaiah is prophesying about the coming dispensation of Jesus in Isaiah chapter 2, remember he says, the law of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem, and his word from Mount Zion. Where's the first gospel sermon preached? Acts chapter 2, in the city of Jerusalem. And what did Jesus told his disciples in Acts chapter 1? You'll be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. Incidentally, I think Luke is sort of sneakily giving you right there an outline for the book of Acts, because that's exactly how he presents it. He presents the gospel preached in Jerusalem, and then into greater Judea, and then in Samaria in chapter 8 when Philip goes down to Samaria, and then into the uttermost parts of the earth beginning in chapter 11 when Paul and Barnabas and Silas and all of those begin to preach throughout the ancient world. And you see the fulfillment of the covenants. Now, I want to close with this and try to draw things in full circle. In John chapter 14, just before Jesus is about to be crucified, he makes a very interesting statement to his disciples that I think has been much misunderstood. He says to them, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are, and depending on your translation, King James says many mansions. I would argue that was a mistake by the King James translators for a number of reasons. Number one, the word that's translated there simply doesn't mean mansion. It means a dwelling place, a room. Number two, they missed the cultural significance of what Jesus is saying there. When a son in that world married a wife, he brought her into his father's house. he would prepare a room to be their new marriage room, their new bedroom. And he would make that ready for her, and he would wed her, and that would be where they would dwell until he became the patriarch. And then they would move into what we would call the master bedroom. All right? What Jesus is saying there is, in my Beit Ab, and that's literally the language he's using, my Father's house, my home. There are many dwelling places. I go to prepare a place for you. Now, if Jesus had been Southern, he'd have said y'all. The word is plural. And I would argue that he's laying the groundwork there for the same imagery that Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 5 when he describes the church as the bride of Christ. Jesus' picture there in John 14 is much more tender and intimate than saying, I'm going to give you a big fat mansion on a hill somewhere. What he's saying is, I'm going to wed you, and I'm going to bring you into my home, and I'm going to make you my own. I'm going to prepare a place for you to be my intimate family. And then I'll come again and receive you unto myself. Let not your heart be troubled. All of this that begins and ends with the concept of family and gets from one family to the other family by way of covenant. Now, last point and then we'll close. The Bible's very clear that we begin as sons and daughters of God. What takes us out of that relationship as sons and daughters of God? Sin, right? Sin separates between us and God, Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. We're very much like the prodigal son that Jesus described in the 15th chapter of the book of Luke when he says to his father, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in thy sight I'm no more worthy to be called thy son. He understood the significance of what he had done in leaving home the way that he did. Make me as one of thy hired servants. The father doesn't do what he asks, does he? Instead, he falls on his neck, he kisses him much, he commands his servants, bring a robe, put it on his back, bring shoes, put them on his feet, bring a ring and put it on his finger, which is a symbol that he's back within the family and able to sign legal documents with the family signet ring. And then he says this my son was dead and he's alive again. We begin as the family of God. We leave the family of God. God extends to us a covenant on human terms. And if we had time, I'd love to have unpacked the covenant of Genesis 15 because God takes the human covenant ritual, stands it on his head, and puts himself in the subservient position with Abraham in order to make that covenant happen. Go research that. It'll be a great study for you. But at any rate, he reaches out to us in covenants that we can understand to bring us back into the family so that he can say, in my Father's house, there are many rooms, and I go to prepare a place for you. That where I am, there you may be also. Thank you so much for your attention.